The night Maya found the cabin, she was 8 years old, soaking wet and so hungry her stomach had stopped hurting 3 days ago. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The rain hammered down through the pine trees like bullets made of ice, and every step Maya took sent muddy water splashing up her already ruined sneakers. She'd been walking for hours, maybe longer. Time felt different when you were alone in the woods with nowhere to go and no one looking for you. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a maze of shadows and dripping branches that all looked the same. Her mother had been gone for 11 days now. 11 days since Mama said she was just going to talk to someone about a job and would be back before dark. 11 days of waiting by the underpass where they'd been sleeping, curled up in cardboard and hope. But Mama never came back. Maya had waited as long as she could. She'd eaten the last granola bar on day 3, drank from the gas station bathroom sink when no one was watching. But on day 9, a man with cold eyes and a police badge started asking questions Maya didn't know how to answer. So she ran. Now here she was, deep in a forest she didn't recognize, chasing the fading memory of something her mother once said, "If you're ever really lost, baby, find shelter first. Worry about everything else after." The rain turned vicious, slashing sideways through the trees. Maya's teeth chattered so hard she bit her tongue. The metallic taste of blood mixed with rainwater as she stumbled forward, one hand reaching out to steady herself against the rough bark of a pine. That's when she saw it. At first it was just a shape, a darker shadow among the grey. But as she got closer, squinting through the downpour, it took form. A cabin, small, stone, nearly swallowed by overgrown vines and moss. It sat in a clearing like something out of a forgotten fairy tale, the kind Mama used to tell her when things weren't so bad. The roof sagged slightly on one side, but it was intact. The windows were dark but unbroken, and most importantly, it had a door. Maya's heart hammered as she approached. Her hands shook, not just from the cold, but from something else. Fear, maybe. Or hope, which sometimes felt like the same thing. She reached the wooden door, weathered and grey, and pressed her small palm against it. It was cool, solid, real. She tried the handle. It didn't budge. Locked. Maya's chest tightened. Of course it was locked. Nothing good ever came easy. She stepped back, scanning the cabin's exterior. That's when she noticed the window on the left side cracked open just an inch. Just enough. She dragged an old stump beneath the window and climbed up, her soaked clothes weighing her down like chains. With trembling fingers, she pushed the window open wider. It groaned in protest but gave way. Maya squeezed through, landing hard on the wooden floor inside. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs. She lay there for a moment, gasping, staring up at a ceiling covered in cobwebs and shadows. But she was inside, out of the rain. Safe, at least for now. Slowly, Maya pulled herself to her feet. The cabin was dark, the kind of dark that felt thick and heavy. She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out the small flashlight she'd found weeks ago behind a dumpster. It flickered when she clicked it on, the battery weak, but it gave just enough light to see. The cabin was one large room with a fireplace on the far wall, a small kitchenette to the right, and a wooden table with 2 chairs in the center. Everything was covered in dust, but beneath it, the place looked strangely cared for. The chairs were pushed in neatly. Dishes sat stacked on a shelf. A wool blanket lay folded on the back of what looked like a reading chair. It was as if someone had left intending to come back, but never did. Maya's wet shoes squeaked against the floorboards as she moved deeper inside. She found matches on the mantel above the fireplace, a box of them, old but dry. Her hands shook as she struck one. The flame burst to life, bright and warm and impossibly beautiful. She lit the candles she found scattered around the room. One by one, soft golden light filled the space, pushing back the shadows. For the first time in days, Maya felt something close to relief. She peeled off her soaking jacket and draped it over one of the chairs. Her shirt clung to her skin, cold and miserable, but there was a trunk in the corner. Inside, she found more blankets, thick and musty but warm. She wrapped herself in one and sank into the reading chair, pulling her knees to her chest. The rain continued to pound against the roof, but inside it was quiet. Still, almost peaceful. Maya closed her eyes and let herself breathe, but she couldn't sleep. Not yet. Something about the cabin felt off. Not dangerous exactly, but intentional, like it was waiting for something, or someone. Her eyes drifted around the room, taking in details she'd missed before. The books on the shelf, their spines cracked and faded, the cast-iron skillet hanging from a hook, no rust, just dust. The rug beneath the table, faded but intricate, woven with patterns that seemed to shift in the candlelight. Maya stood and walked to the rug. She crouched down, running her fingers along its edge. That's when she felt it. A slight depression in the floor beneath. A groove, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Her heart started to race again. She pulled the rug back slowly, inch by inch, revealing the wooden floorboards beneath. And there, almost invisible in the dim light, was a seam. A square outline cut into the floor. A hatch. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She traced the edges with her fingertips, searching for a handle or a latch. On the far side, she found it. A small iron ring, flush with the wood. She hooked her fingers through it and pulled. The hatch resisted at first, decades of stillness making it stubborn. But Maya pulled harder, using both hands, her small frame straining. With a groan of old wood and rusted hinges, the hatch lifted. A rush of cool, dry air escaped from below. Maya grabbed her flashlight and aimed it into the opening. A staircase, stone steps descending into darkness. Her stomach flipped. Every instinct told her to close the hatch, to leave it alone, to just curl up in the blanket and pretend she'd never found it. But Maya had learned a long time ago that survival meant being curious, even when it was scary. Especially when it was scary. She lowered herself onto the first step. It was solid, cold beneath her bare feet. She took another step, then another. The walls on either side were smooth stone, almost like a tunnel. The air smelled different down here. Not musty like the cabin above, but clean, preserved. At the bottom of the staircase, maybe 15 steps down, the space opened up. Maya swept her flashlight across the room and gasped. It was huge, far bigger than the cabin above. The underground room stretched out like a hidden world, supported by thick wooden beams and stone pillars. Shelves lined the walls, floor to ceiling, filled with canned goods, sealed containers, bottled water, blankets, tools, boxes labeled in careful handwriting. In the center of the room sat a large wooden table covered with papers, maps, and books. Against the far wall stood several filing cabinets, their metal surfaces dull with age but intact. And in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a door, a heavy one with a lock. Maya moved slowly through the space, her flashlight beam dancing across decades of carefully preserved supplies. She opened one of the containers. Inside were packages of dried food still sealed. She opened another. Medical supplies, bandages, bottles of pills, antiseptic, all organized and labeled. Someone had built this place with purpose. This wasn't just a storm shelter or a hideout. This was a refuge, a sanctuary meant to last. On the table, beneath a layer of dust, Maya found a leather-bound journal. She picked it up carefully, her small hands barely able to hold it. The cover was embossed with initials, ER. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, looping, feminine. January 14th, 1976. If someone is reading this, then I'm likely gone. But what I've protected remains. This place was built out of necessity and love, for those who lost everything, for those who were silenced. I only hope whoever finds this understands what's at stake. Maya's pulse quickened. She flipped through more pages, entries about construction, about supplies, about plans. And then, halfway through, the entries changed. They became urgent, desperate. They know I have the documents. They've been watching the house. I moved everything here 3 days ago. If anything happens to me, it's all below. The second door, The key is hidden where only the brave or the lost would look. I pray someone finds it. I pray it's not too late." Maya's hands trembled as she closed the journal. She looked toward the locked door in the corner, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. What was behind it? And who was ER? The candle she'd brought down with her flickered, casting wild shadows on the stone walls. Maya knew she should go back upstairs, eat something, rest. But she couldn't move. She was 8 years old, homeless, alone, and standing in the middle of a mystery someone had died protecting. For the first time in 11 days, she didn't feel small. She felt like she'd found something important, something that mattered. She walked to the locked door and pressed her ear against it. Silence. But it wasn't empty silence. It was the kind of silence that held secrets. Maya stepped back and looked around the room again. The key is hidden where only the brave or the lost would look. She was both, and she was going to find it. Maya climbed back up the stone staircase, the journal tucked under her arm like treasure. Her mind raced with questions she didn't have answers for, but her body reminded her of more immediate needs. She was cold, hungry, and exhausted in a way that made her bones ache. Back in the cabin, she carefully closed the hatch and pulled the rug over it again. She didn't know why she felt the need to hide it, but instinct told her some things were safer, kept secret. At the kitchenette, she found a manual can opener in one of the drawers. Everything in this place was old, but functional, like time had stopped the moment someone walked out the door. She grabbed one of the cans from downstairs, soup, chicken noodle, the label faded but readable. Her hands shook as she worked the opener around the lid. When it finally popped free, the smell hit her. Rich, salty, real food. She didn't bother heating it. She drank straight from the can, the cold soup sliding down her throat like liquid gold. It was the best thing she'd tasted in weeks. After eating 2 cans, she felt almost human again. The rain had softened to a gentle patter against the roof. Maya found a dry shirt in the trunk, way too big for her, but it smelled like cedar and safety. She pulled it on over her damp clothes and wrapped herself in the blanket again. The reading chair became her nest. She pulled her knees up, the journal resting in her lap, and began to read by candlelight. January 21st, 1976. The families came to me today, 12 of them, all holding deeds they were told were worthless. But I've seen the original documents. I know what was done to them. They didn't just lose their land. They lost their history, their legacy, everything their grandparents built. And the men who took it are still walking free, still profiting, still pretending they did nothing wrong. I can't stay silent anymore. Maya didn't understand all the words, but she understood enough. Someone had stolen from people. Someone named ER had tried to help. And something bad had happened because of it. She flipped through more entries, each one revealing pieces of a story that felt too big for an 8-year-old to hold. But Maya had learned that the world didn't care how old you were when it handed you its weight. March 3rd, 1976. I've made copies of everything. Land deeds, contracts, the falsified documents, all of it. I've stored them in the place no one knows about. The cabin was my grandfather's. When he died, he left it to me, but I never registered the transfer. As far as the county knows, it doesn't exist. No records, no trail. If they come for me, they'll search my house, my office, everywhere but here. This is my insurance, my last act of defiance. Maya's throat tightened. She looked around the cabin with new eyes. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a vault, a hiding place for truth. April 17th, 1976. I haven't written in weeks because I've been too afraid. They know. I don't know how, but they know I have something. A man came to my office yesterday, said he was from the county assessor, but his eyes were wrong, cold. He asked questions that weren't questions, threats disguised as concern. I lied, said I didn't know what he was talking about. But I saw the way he looked at me, like I was already dead. I'm leaving tomorrow. I'll take what I can and disappear. The cabin will keep the rest safe until someone braver than me can finish this." The entry ended there. Maya turned the page, but the rest of the journal was blank. She sat in the silence, her small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. ER had run, or tried to, and she never came back. Which meant she never got to finish what she started. Maya closed the journal and stared at the dying candle on the table. She thought about her mother, about the promises people made and couldn't keep, about how the world was full of unfinished things. But this, whatever ER had protected, it was still here, still waiting. The key is hidden where only the brave or the lost would look. Maya stood up, letting the blanket fall from her shoulders. She walked slowly around the cabin, her eyes scanning every surface, every corner, every shadow. Where would someone hide a key? Not somewhere obvious, not somewhere easy, somewhere meaningful. Her gaze landed on the bookshelf. There were maybe 30 books, their spines cracked and faded. Titles about history, law, poetry. She ran her fingers along them, pulling each one out slightly, checking behind them. Nothing. She moved to the fireplace. The stones were rough and uneven, gaps between them where mortar had crumbled away. She pressed her fingers into the gaps, feeling for anything hidden. Still nothing. The trunk in the corner had already been opened. She checked it again anyway, pulling out blankets and old clothes, feeling along the bottom. Empty. Maya sat down on the floor, frustration building in her chest. She was 8. She didn't know how to solve mysteries. She didn't know what brave people did or where lost people looked. She only knew how to survive, how to stay quiet, how to disappear. But maybe that was enough. She thought about the last few weeks. Where had she hidden things when she needed to keep them safe? Not in obvious places. She'd tucked her flashlight inside a hollowed-out book she'd found in a library dumpster. She'd kept Mama's photograph folded inside the sole of her shoe. She'd learned that the best hiding spots were the ones that looked like nothing. Her eyes drifted back to the bookshelf. Not behind the books. Inside one. She stood and approached the shelf again, this time pulling each book out completely, opening it, checking for hollow spaces. The first 5 were solid. The 6th fell apart in her hands, pages crumbling. The 7th, 8th, 9th, nothing. Then she reached for a thick volume near the end. The cover read, "A People's History." It was heavier than the others. She opened it. The pages had been carved out, hollowed, and nestled inside the rectangular cavity was a small brass key. Maya's breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she lifted it free. It was cold, surprisingly heavy, with an ornate bow and a long shaft, exactly the kind of key that would fit an old, serious lock. She clutched it to her chest and turned toward the hatch. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Every instinct told her to wait, to think, to be careful. But another voice, quieter, braver, whispered, "You found it for a reason." Maya descended the stone staircase for the second time that night, the brass key gripped tightly in her fist. The candle she carried cast flickering shadows that danced along the walls like restless spirits. At the bottom, the underground room waited, silent and patient. She crossed to the locked door in the corner, her bare feet soundless against the cold stone floor. Up close, the door was more imposing than she'd realized. Thick wood, reinforced with iron bands, and a lock that looked like it belonged on a castle. She slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. For a moment, Maya hesitated. Her hand hovered over the key, frozen by the weight of what came next. Once she turned it, there was no going back. Whatever ER had hidden, whatever truth had cost her everything, would become Maya's burden too. But Maya had been carrying impossible things her whole life. What was one more? She turned the key. The lock clicked, deep and final, like a secret exhaling after 40 years of holding its breath. Maya pulled the door open. It was heavier than she expected, groaning on ancient hinges, but it swung inward to reveal another room, smaller than the first but just as carefully preserved. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, 8 of them, each labeled with years, 1968 through 1976. In the center stood a large metal desk, and on top of it sat neat stacks of folders, a typewriter, and a map of the surrounding county pinned beneath a paperweight. Maya approached the desk slowly, her candlelight catching on the edges of yellowed papers. She set the candle down carefully and picked up the folder on top. Inside were documents, legal papers with official seals, signatures in blue ink, and stamps that read "recorded" and "certified." She couldn't read most of it. The words were too big, too complicated. But she recognized names: Patterson, Whitmore, Holloway, and at the bottom of nearly every document, one signature appeared again and again. Samuel Thorne, County Assessor. She opened another folder. More deeds, more signatures, more stamps. But these looked different, sloppier. The dates didn't match. Some signatures looked traced, like someone had tried to copy them. Maya's brow furrowed. Even at 8, she understood what a fake looked like. She'd seen enough forged permission slips and copied handwriting in her short life to recognize it. On the wall behind the desk hung a large map, hand-drawn, with parcels of land marked in different colors. Red for one family, blue for another, green, yellow, purple. Dozens of them, all labeled with names and dates. And over many of the parcels, thick black X's had been drawn. Beside each X a note: seized, January 1972. Foreclosed, August 1973. Sold to county, March 1974. It was a map of loss, of theft, of families erased from their own history. Maya traced her finger over the names. Chen, Morrison, Delgado, Williams. Families she didn't know but could imagine. People like her and Mama. People who had something, then didn't. She pulled open one of the filing cabinet drawers. It was filled with folders, each one labeled with a family name. She pulled one at random. Rodriguez. Inside was everything. The original deed, signed in 1897 by a man named Mateo Rodriguez. Letters from his children. Photographs of a small farm, a family standing proud in front of a wooden house. Tax records showing payments made every year, on time, without fail. And then in 1973, a notice of foreclosure. Falsified documents claiming missed payments that the tax records proved were made. A forged signature selling the land to the county for a fraction of its worth. And finally, a bill of sale transferring that same land to a private company owned by Samuel Thorne. Maya's stomach turned. She didn't understand all the legal words, but she understood stealing. She understood what it meant when someone took something that wasn't theirs and pretended it was legal. She closed the Rodriguez file and opened another. The story was the same, and another, same again. Every file in every cabinet told the same story. Families losing everything to lies, and one man, Samuel Thorne, getting rich from their loss. Maya sat down hard on the stone floor, surrounded by filing cabinets full of evidence, and felt the weight of it settle on her small shoulders. ER had collected all of this, had risked everything to preserve it. And then she'd disappeared, leaving it buried, waiting for someone to find. Someone brave or lost enough to look. Maya pressed her hands to her face. She wanted to cry, but tears didn't come. She'd used them all up weeks ago. Instead, she just sat there, breathing, thinking, trying to figure out what an 8-year-old girl with no home and no family was supposed to do with the truth. The candle flickered, wax pooling on the desk. Maya stood and walked back to the map on the wall. She studied it closer this time, looking for anything familiar. And then she saw it. One parcel, marked in faded blue, labeled Reyes Family, 1879 to 1974. Foreclosed. The boundaries matched the land where the underpass was. The place she and Mama had been sleeping. The place that was now a highway. Her breath caught. Even the ground beneath her had been stolen from someone. She traced the boundary lines with her finger, following them north toward the forest, toward where the cabin sat. And that's when she noticed something else. The cabin wasn't on the map. The land around it was marked, parceled, labeled. But the spot where the cabin stood was blank, unmarked, unrecorded, invisible. ER's grandfather had left her a ghost, a place that didn't exist on paper, the perfect hiding spot for truth no one wanted found. Maya carefully closed the folders and returned them to their cabinets. She picked up the candle and took one last look around the room. 40 years of secrets, families who never got justice, a woman who gave everything to protect evidence no one had ever seen. Until now. As she climbed back up the stairs, the brass key heavy in her pocket, Maya made a decision. She didn't know how yet, didn't know who to tell or what to do. But she wasn't going to let this stay buried. ER had been brave enough to collect it. Maya would be brave enough to finish it. Back in the cabin, she curled up in the reading chair, the journal open in her lap, and read by the dying light of the candle. The last entry, written in shaking handwriting, almost illegible. April 18th, 1976. If you're reading this, then I didn't make it. But you did. You found the cabin, you found the key, you found the truth. Don't let it die with me. These families deserve their names back, their land back, their legacy. I couldn't do it alone. But maybe you're stronger than I was. Maybe you're exactly who this story needed. Finish what I started, make them remember, make them pay. Eleanor Rose. Maya closed the journal, her small hands trembling. Eleanor. ER. Eleanor Rose. She whispered the name into the darkness like a prayer. Outside, the rain had stopped. The forest was silent. And inside the forgotten cabin, an 8-year-old girl who had nothing decided she would give everything to make sure Eleanor Rose hadn't died for nothing. Because some truths are too important to stay buried, and some promises are kept by people who never knew they were making them. What happens next will turn this forgotten cabin into the center of a fight for justice, reveal secrets that powerful people buried decades ago, and prove that courage doesn't need age, just heart. Stay tuned to see what Maya does with the truth she found. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Maya woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin windows, dust particles dancing in the golden beams like tiny stars. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then, reality settled back in, heavy and real. The cabin, the bunker, Eleanor Rose, the truth buried beneath her feet. She sat up in the reading chair, her neck stiff from sleeping curled up. The journal had fallen to the floor during the night. She picked it up carefully, running her fingers over the embossed initials. ER. Eleanor Rose, a woman who died protecting secrets that could change everything. Maya's stomach growled, pulling her back to immediate needs. She went to the kitchenette and opened another can, this time peaches in syrup. She ate them slowly, savoring each sweet piece, letting the sugar wake her up. Through the window, the forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, almost peaceful. Birds sang in the trees, sunlight filtered through the leaves in scattered patterns. For the first time in weeks, Maya felt something close to safe, but safety was temporary. She knew that better than most 8-year-olds. Mama had taught her that nothing lasted. Not the good stuff anyway, the bad stuff that lingered. That stuck around whether you wanted it to or not. She finished the peaches and wiped her hands on the oversized shirt she'd slept in. Then she descended into the bunker again, this time with purpose. The underground rooms felt different in her second visit, less frightening, more familiar. She moved through the first chamber, taking inventory of what Eleanor had left behind. Canned goods, probably 200 of them. Bottled water, at least 50 gallons, medical supplies, blankets, tools, batteries, everything someone would need to survive for months, maybe longer. Eleanor had prepared this place like she was planning for the end of the world, or maybe just the end of her own. Maya entered the locked room, the archive as she'd started thinking of it. She pulled out filing cabinet drawers one by one, carefully removing folders and spreading them across the metal desk. She couldn't read most of the legal language, but she could read names. And she could understand dates. The pattern became clearer the more she looked. Between 1968 and 1976, 43 families had lost their land. All of them in the same county. all of them through foreclosures that the evidence suggested were fraudulent. And all of that land had ended up in the hands of the same man, Samuel Thorne. She found photographs in some of the files, families standing in front of homes they'd built with their own hands, children playing in yards that no longer belonged to them, elderly couples holding deeds their grandparents had signed, papers that should have protected them but didn't. Maya stared at their faces. They looked like people she'd seen on the streets, tired, worn down, defeated. People who'd lost something they could never get back. In the Chen family file, she found a letter written in shaky handwriting. It was addressed to Eleanor Rose, dated March 7, 1976. Miss Rose, you said you would help us. You said you had proof. But it's been 3 months and nothing has changed. They took our farm last week. My father is 82 years old. He built that house with his own hands in 1923. Now we're living with my sister in a 2-bedroom apartment in town. 6 of us in 2 rooms. My father doesn't speak anymore, just sits by the window staring at nothing. I don't blame you. I know you tried, but I need you to understand what it costs when promises break. Some things can't be fixed. Some losses don't heal. Thank you for caring, even if it wasn't enough. Respectfully, Thomas Chen. Maya's hands trembled as she set the letter down. The weight of it pressed against her chest like a stone. These weren't just files. These were lives. Real people who'd suffered while someone stole from them and got away with it. She spent hours going through the documents, sorting them, trying to make sense of the scope. By mid-afternoon, she'd created piles, original deeds in one stack, foreclosure notices in another, falsified documents in a third, and in the fourth pile, the evidence that tied it all to Samuel Thorne. That's when she found the additional folder, separate from the family files, labeled simply Thorne. Inside was everything Eleanor had compiled on the man himself. Newspaper clippings showing him at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, shaking hands with politicians, accepting awards for community service, articles about his real estate company, Thorne Development, and how it had transformed the county. Photographs of the mansion he'd built on the hill overlooking town, the one everyone called Thorne Estate. And buried in the back of the folder, a handwritten note from Eleanor. Samuel Thorne is protected. I've tried going to the sheriff, to the district attorney, even to the newspaper. No one will touch this. They either don't believe me or they're too afraid of what he'll do. Thorne has connections everywhere. Money buys silence. Power buys compliance. I've documented everything, but documentation means nothing if no one with authority will act. I'm out of options. All I can do now is preserve the evidence and pray that someday, when he's gone or his power has faded, someone will have the courage to bring this to light. That someone can't be me anymore. They're watching. I have to disappear. Maya sat back in the metal chair, the weight of Eleanor's words settling over her. 40 years had passed since Eleanor wrote that. Samuel Thorne might be dead by now, or he might not. Either way, Maya was holding evidence that could destroy whatever legacy he'd built. But she was 8 years old, homeless and completely alone. Who would believe her? Who would even listen? She thought about the letter from Thomas Chen. Some things can't be fixed. Some losses don't heal. Maybe that was true. Maybe the families who'd lost their land were gone now, scattered or deceased. Maybe it was too late to give them justice, but it wasn't too late for the truth. Eleanor had died protecting it. The least Maya could do was make sure people knew. She carefully returned the files to their cabinets, organizing them the way Eleanor had, by family name and date. Then she took the Thorne folder and brought it upstairs with her. In the cabin, she sat at the wooden table and opened Eleanor's journal again, this time reading from the beginning. The early entries were different from the desperate ones near the end. They were hopeful, determined, filled with plans. January 14th, 1976. I met with the Rodriguez family today. Showed them the original documents proving their land payments were made on time, every time. Mr. Rodriguez wept, said he thought he was losing his mind, that maybe he had forgotten to pay, maybe it was his fault. But it wasn't. It was never their fault. I promised him I would fix this. I promised I would make sure everyone knew what Thorne did. I'm going to the authorities next week with everything I've compiled. Surely when they see the evidence, they'll have to act. Justice isn't optional, it's supposed to be guaranteed. Maya's throat tightened. Eleanor had believed in justice, had believed that evidence mattered, that truth would win. But it hadn't, at least not for her. The later entries showed the hope crumbling. February 9th, 1976. The district attorney refused to meet with me. His secretary said he's too busy, but I saw the look in her eyes. Fear. Someone got to him first. February 23rd, 1976. I went to the newspaper. The editor listened to my entire presentation, looked through every document. Then he said, "This is quite a story, Miss Rose. Unfortunately, we can't run it. Mr. Thorne is one of our largest advertisers. I'm sure you understand." I told him I didn't understand. He told me I should learn to. March 15th, 1976. Someone broke into my apartment last night. Nothing was taken, but my files were disturbed. They wanted me to know they could get to me whenever they wanted. I've moved everything to the cabin. It's the only place they don't know about, the only place I have left. Maya closed the journal and stared out the window. Eleanor had been so alone, fighting something so much bigger than herself with no one to help. Maya understood that feeling. She'd been alone since Mama disappeared, alone in ways that made the world feel impossibly big and herself impossibly small. But Eleanor hadn't given up. Even when everyone turned away, even when she knew she was in danger, she'd kept fighting, kept documenting, kept hoping that someday someone would finish what she started. Maya stood and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction. Somewhere beyond those trees was the town, the place where Samuel Thorne had built his empire on stolen land, the place where 43 families had lost everything, the place where Eleanor Rose had disappeared and no one had cared enough to ask why. Maya made a decision then, standing in that forgotten cabin with sunlight warming her face. She couldn't do this alone. She needed help. But not from authorities who'd already failed Eleanor, not from newspapers that valued advertising over truth. She needed someone who didn't have anything to lose, someone who would believe an 8-year-old girl with grease-stained clothes and an impossible story. She needed to find someone kind. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Maya prepared to leave. She packed a small bag with some canned food, a bottle of water, and Eleanor's journal. She took one of the blankets from the trunk and rolled it tight. Then she locked the cabin door from the inside, climbed back out the window she'd entered through, and made her way toward town. The walk took almost 2 hours. By the time she emerged from the forest onto a paved road, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She followed the road until she saw lights in the distance. Buildings, civilization. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Main Street had maybe a dozen shops, most of them already closed for the evening. A diner glowed warm and inviting on the corner. Maya's stomach growled at the smell of cooking food drifting through the air. But she didn't have any money. Hadn't had money in longer than she could remember. She walked past the diner, past the hardware store and the pharmacy, until she reached a small brick building with a sign that read, Blue Hollow Public Library. The lights were still on inside. Through the window, she could see shelves of books and a woman behind the desk, grey-haired and kind-faced, reading beneath a small lamp. Maya hesitated at the door. Libraries had always been safe places. Warm in winter, cool in summer, and full of people who valued quiet. She pushed the door open and a small bell chimed above her head. The woman at the desk looked up, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. She studied Maya for a long moment, taking in the oversized shirt, the dirty sneakers, the tangled hair. But her expression didn't change to judgment or suspicion. Instead, she smiled. "Hello there," the woman said gently. "Can I help you find something?" Maya stood frozen in the doorway, suddenly unsure. What was she supposed to say? That she'd found a secret bunker full of evidence proving a massive land fraud? that she needed someone to believe her even though she was just a kid with no proof except documents she couldn't carry and a story no one would accept. Maya started, her voice cracking from disuse. I need help. The woman's expression softened further. She stood slowly, moving around the desk with careful, non-threatening movements. Okay, she said simply. What kind of help do you need? Maya's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. It had been so long since someone asked what she needed, so long since anyone cared. I found something, she whispered. Something important, but I don't know what to do with it. The woman knelt down, bringing herself to Maya's eye level. Up close, her eyes were warm brown, lined with wrinkles that suggested a lifetime of smiling. My name is Margaret, she said. Margaret Westwood. I'm the librarian here, have been for 32 years. And you are? Maya, she said quietly. Margaret nodded. It's nice to meet you, Maya. Now, why don't you tell me about this important thing you found? Maya hesitated, but something in Margaret's face, the patience, the genuine concern, made her feel like maybe, just maybe, this was someone who would listen. Do you know who Eleanor Rose was? Maya asked. Margaret's expression shifted. Surprise flickered across her features, followed by something deeper. Recognition. Sadness. Eleanor Rose, Margaret repeated slowly. I haven't heard that name in 40 years. You knew her? Maya's heart raced. Margaret stood, gesturing toward a small reading area with comfortable chairs. Come sit down. This sounds like a conversation that needs time. They settled into the chairs, and Margaret folded her hands in her lap. Eleanor Rose was a legal secretary who worked for the county attorney's office back in the 70s. She was brilliant, dedicated, and she believed in justice with a passion that was rare even then. But she disappeared in the spring of 1976, just vanished without a trace. Some people thought she'd left town. Others suspected something darker. What did you think? Maya asked. Margaret's eyes grew distant. I thought she'd found something someone didn't want found. Eleanor was investigating land deals, foreclosures, things that didn't add up. She came to the library often, researching property records, looking through old newspapers. She knew something was wrong, and then one day, she was gone. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out Eleanor's journal. She held it out to Margaret with trembling hands. She didn't run away. She tried to hide. She built a bunker and filled it with evidence. Then she wrote this. Margaret took the journal carefully, her hands shaking slightly. She opened it to the first page and read Eleanor's handwriting. Her eyes widened. She flipped through more pages, reading quickly, her expression growing more shocked with each entry. Where did you find this? Margaret whispered. In a cabin in the woods, the one that belonged to her grandfather. She left everything there, all the files, all the proof, everything she collected about what Samuel Thorne did. Margaret looked up sharply. Samuel Thorne? Maya nodded. He stole land from 43 families, used fake documents and foreclosures that weren't real. Eleanor had proof of all of it. She tried to tell people, but no one would listen. So she hid it and hoped someone would find it someday. Margaret set the journal down carefully, like it was made of glass. She pressed her hands to her face, breathing slowly. When she finally looked at Maya again, her eyes were red. 43 families, she repeated. My God. Do you believe me? Maya asked, her voice small. Margaret reached out and took Maya's hand. Sweet girl, I believe you. Eleanor wouldn't have documented something that wasn't true. And Samuel Thorne, she paused, choosing her words carefully. He's a powerful man, built half this town with his development company. But there were always rumors, whispers about how he acquired so much land so quickly. No one ever proved anything, or maybe no one dared to. Is he still alive? Maya asked. Margaret nodded slowly. He's 89 years old now, lives up at Thorne Estate with his son Richard. They control most of the county's commercial real estate. The family is, she hesitated, untouchable. Maya's chest tightened. But the evidence is all there, in the cabin, in the bunker, everything Eleanor collected. Doesn't that matter? It matters, Margaret said firmly. But evidence alone isn't enough. We need someone who can do something with it. Someone with authority and integrity. She thought for a moment. There's a man I know, Thomas Winters. He's a retired judge who now works with the Innocence Coalition, a group that investigates historical injustices. He's honest, which is rare, and he's not afraid of powerful people, which is rarer still. Hope flickered in Maya's chest. Would he help us? I think he might, Margaret said. But first, I need to see what you've found. Can you take me to the cabin? Maya nodded. Tomorrow, in the daylight. It's a long walk. Margaret squeezed her hand gently. Tomorrow then. But tonight you're staying with me. You look like you haven't had a proper meal or a safe bed in a very long time. Maya's defenses rose automatically. I'm okay. I can take care of myself. I'm sure you can, Margaret said kindly, but you don't have to. Not tonight. Something in Maya broke then. The walls she'd built to survive, to keep going when everything fell apart, they crumbled just a little. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Margaret pulled her into a hug, warm and solid and real. For the first time since Mama disappeared, Maya let herself be held. That night, Maya slept in a real bed in Margaret's small house on the edge of town. She ate soup and bread and drank hot chocolate that tasted like childhood should have. And when she finally closed her eyes, she didn't dream of rain or fear or being alone. She dreamed of Eleanor Rose, standing in a cabin full of light, smiling like maybe, just maybe, her hope hadn't been wasted after all. The next morning arrived with the smell of pancakes and the sound of birds singing outside the window. Maya woke slowly, disoriented by the softness of the mattress beneath her, the warmth of the quilted blanket, the absence of fear. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then memory returned. Margaret, the library, Eleanor's journal. She sat up, her body stiff, but rested in a way it hadn't been in months. Through the bedroom door, she could hear the gentle clatter of dishes and the hum of someone moving around a kitchen with purpose. She climbed out of bed, still wearing the oversized shirt from the cabin, and padded barefoot into the hallway. Margaret's house was small, but felt enormous compared to the spaces Maya had been living in. Photographs lined the walls, books filled every available shelf. Plants sat in windows, green and thriving. It was the kind of home that held memories. The good kind. Good morning, Margaret called from the kitchen. I hope you like pancakes. I made extra. Maya entered the kitchen to find a plate stacked high with golden pancakes, syrup and butter already on the table. Her stomach growled loud enough that Margaret laughed. Sit, eat. We have a long day ahead of us. Maya sat and ate like she was afraid the food might disappear. Margaret watched her with concern, but didn't comment, just quietly refilled her glass of orange juice and added another pancake to her plate. When Maya finally slowed down, Margaret poured herself coffee and sat across from her. I called Thomas Winters last night after you fell asleep. Told him I had something urgent he needed to see. He's driving up from the city today. Should be here by early afternoon. Maya swallowed her bite of pancake. What did you tell him? Not much, Margaret admitted. Just that new evidence had surfaced regarding land transactions from the 1970s. Thomas doesn't need details to be intrigued. He's spent his retirement investigating exactly these kinds of cases. She paused. But Maya, before we go to the cabin, I need to ask you something. Maya set down her fork, suddenly wary. Where are your parents? Margaret asked gently. The question landed like a stone in Maya's stomach. My mum's gone. I don't have a dad. At least not one I've ever met. Gone as in? Margaret's voice was careful. She left 11 days ago. Said she was getting a job. Never came back. Margaret's expression crumpled with sadness. And you've been on your own since then? Maya nodded, not trusting her voice. Oh, sweetheart. Margaret reached across the table but didn't touch her, respecting the space Maya needed. We need to report that. Your mother could be in trouble, could need help. Or she left because she didn't want me anymore, Maya said, the words bitter and hard. Margaret shook her head firmly. I don't believe that. But either way, you deserve to be safe and cared for. After we meet with Thomas, after we deal with Eleanor's evidence, we're going to figure out your situation, okay? Maya wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle things herself, but the pancakes in her stomach and the warm bed she'd slept in and the kindness in Margaret's eyes made her realize how tired she was of handling things alone. Okay, she whispered. They left for the cabin an hour later, Margaret's old sedan bumping along the dirt road that led toward the forest. Maya directed her from the passenger seat, recognizing landmarks she'd passed on her desperate walk through the rain. The closer they got, the more nervous she became. What if Margaret saw the cabin and decided Maya had made the whole thing up? What if the bunker had somehow disappeared, like a dream that evaporated in daylight? But when they arrived, the cabin stood exactly where Maya had left it, stone walls solid and real, vines crawling up its sides like nature trying to reclaim what humans had abandoned. Margaret parked and stepped out slowly, staring at the structure with wonder. I'd heard rumors about Old Man Barrett's cabin, but I never knew exactly where it was. This is, she paused, searching for words, remarkably preserved. Eleanor kept it that way, Maya said. She kept everything that way. They entered through the front door. Maya had retrieved the key from where she'd hidden it under a stone. Inside, the cabin looked exactly as she'd left it. The reading chair with the blanket, the trunk in the corner, the rug covering the hatch. Margaret moved through the space reverently, running her fingers along the bookshelf, studying the titles. This was Eleanor's sanctuary, she murmured. Her last stand. It's more than that, Maya said. She walked to the center of the room and pulled back the rug, revealing the hatch. Margaret gasped. Maya opened it, the hinges groaning their familiar protest. This is where she kept everything. They descended together, Margaret moving carefully down the stone steps. When they reached the bottom and Maya's flashlight illuminated the underground chamber, Margaret stopped breathing. The shelves of supplies, the filing cabinets, the careful organization of everything Eleanor had preserved. This is incredible, Margaret whispered. She built a time capsule. Maya led her to the locked room, already open from yesterday's visit. Inside, Margaret approached the filing cabinets with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. She pulled open drawers, leafing through files, her hands trembling. She read document after document, her expression shifting from shock to anger to heartbreak. It's all here, Margaret said, her voice thick. Every fraudulent foreclosure, every forged signature, every piece of stolen land. This is enough to... She couldn't finish. To destroy Samuel Thorne's legacy, Maya offered. Margaret looked at her, this small 8-year-old girl who'd found what trained investigators and journalists had missed for 40 years. Yes, Margaret said, to destroy it completely. They spent the next 2 hours going through files, Margaret taking photographs with her phone, documenting everything. She handled each folder with care, reading Thomas Chen's letter with tears in her eyes, studying the map of stolen land with clenched fists. When they finally emerged back into the cabin, the morning had turned to early afternoon. Margaret sat heavily in the reading chair, overwhelmed. Eleanor died protecting this, she said quietly. And no one even looked for her. We're looking now, Maya said. We're finishing what she started. Margaret smiled sadly. You're right. We are. They locked up the cabin and drove back to town, arriving just as a silver car pulled up in front of the library. A tall man in his 60s stepped out, grey-haired and distinguished, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Thomas Winters looked exactly like what he was, a retired judge who'd seen every kind of injustice and refused to look away. Margaret made introductions in the library's small conference room, and Maya watched as Thomas studied her with curiosity and respect, not the dismissal most adults showed children. Margaret tells me you found something significant, he said, his voice deep and measured. She wasn't exaggerating, was she? Maya shook her head. No, sir. Then I'm listening. Maya told the story from the beginning. The rain, the cabin, the hatch, Eleanor's journal, the bunker full of evidence. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression growing more intense with each detail. When she finished, he sat back and exhaled slowly. Eleanor rose. I remember when she disappeared. I was practicing law back then, young and idealistic. I heard rumors about what she'd been investigating, but nothing ever came of it. Because Samuel Thorne made sure nothing would, Margaret said. Thomas nodded grimly. The Thorne family has deep roots and deeper pockets. But if what you're describing is real, if Eleanor documented everything, he paused, the lawyer in him calculating possibilities, we might finally have enough to pierce that armor. The documents are real, Maya said firmly. I can show you. What comes next will expose decades of buried crimes, bring a powerful family to its knees, and prove that an 8-year-old girl with nothing but courage can shake the foundations of an entire town. Stay with us to see how Maya's discovery changes everything. If this story is moving you, please like, share, and subscribe for more incredible true tales. Thomas Winters stood in the bunker beneath the cabin, his lawyer's mind working through implications with every file he examined. He'd been reading for over an hour, and his expression had gone from professional interest to barely contained fury. This is airtight, he said finally, setting down the Rodriguez file. 43 cases of documented fraud, forged signatures, falsified payment records, manufactured foreclosures, and every piece of stolen property traced directly to Samuel Thorne. He turned to Maya, who sat on the stone steps watching him. Eleanor Rose was meticulous. This evidence would hold up in any court in the country. So we can get justice for those families? Maya asked. Thomas's expression complicated. The families themselves, most are likely deceased after 40 years, but their descendants, their heirs, they have standing. Property rights don't expire. If we can prove these foreclosures were fraudulent, those deeds could be challenged, possibly overturned. How long would that take? Margaret asked from where she stood by the map. Years, Thomas admitted. Legal proceedings of this magnitude, against a family as powerful as the Thornes, it won't be quick or easy. But, he looked at the filing cabinets surrounding them, it's winnable. That's more than most historical justice cases can claim. He pulled out his phone and began taking detailed photographs, documenting everything systematically. I'll need to make copies of all of this, file by file, page by page. Then I'll need to verify Eleanor's disappearance was never properly investigated, establish chain of custody for the evidence, and build a coalition of attorneys willing to take this on. Pro bono, I assume, Margaret said dryly. Thomas smiled. Margaret, for a case like this, I'd pay for the privilege. He turned back to Maya. But there's something you need to understand. Once we go public with this, once we file suit, the Thorne family will come after us with everything they have. Legal threats, intimidation, character assassination. They've protected this secret for 40 years. They won't give up without a fight. Maya thought about Eleanor, running scared, hiding in a cabin, eventually disappearing. She thought about the families whose faces stared out from old photographs, people who'd lost everything and never got it back. And she thought about herself, an 8-year-old with nothing left to lose. I'm not afraid of them, she said quietly. Thomas studied her for a long moment. No, he said finally. I don't think you are. They worked until evening fell, Thomas photographing every document while Margaret created detailed inventories. Maya helped organize files, her small hands careful with the fragile papers. When they finally emerged from the bunker, exhausted and overwhelmed, the forest had gone dark around them. Back at Margaret's house, Thomas made phone calls while Maya and Margaret prepared dinner. His voice drifted from the living room, professional and persuasive. I need your expertise on a land fraud case. Yes, multi-generational. 43 properties. I'm sending you documentation now. No, I'm completely serious. By the time they sat down to eat, Thomas had assembled a preliminary team. 3 attorneys specializing in property law, 2 investigators, and a forensic document analyst. They're all people I trust, he explained. People who won't be bought or intimidated. We start building the case tomorrow. What about Maya? Margaret asked quietly. Thomas set down his fork. What about her? She's 8 years old, homeless, and sitting on evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful families in the state. She needs protection. Margaret hesitated. She needs someone to look after her properly. Maya's chest tightened. I can take care of myself. You shouldn't have to, Margaret said gently. Thomas looked between them. Margaret, are you suggesting? Temporarily, Margaret said quickly. Just until we figure out what happened to her mother, get her situation stabilized. I have the room. I have the time. And? She looked at Maya with something like affection. I'd like to help if she'll let me. Maya stared at her plate, emotions churning. Part of her wanted to run, to refuse help, to maintain the independence that had kept her alive. But another part, the part that had slept in a real bed and eaten pancakes and felt safe for the first time in months, that part wanted to stay. Okay, she whispered. Temporarily. Margaret smiled, eyes bright. Thomas nodded approvingly. Good. Now, about going public with this. He pulled out a notepad covered in his neat handwriting. I've been thinking about strategy. We can't just file suit and hope for the best. The Thorns will bury it in motions and delays. We need public pressure. The newspaper, Margaret suggested. The original editor who refused Eleanor might be gone by now. He is, Thomas confirmed. Died in 98. Current editor is Amanda Chen. Maya's head snapped up. Chen, like Thomas Chen from the files. Thomas's eyebrows rose. You read the letters? All of them, Maya said. Thomas smiled. Then you know why Amanda Chen might be very interested in this story. Thomas Chen was her grandfather. She grew up hearing about how the family lost their farm, how it destroyed her great-grandfather. If we approach her with evidence proving it was theft, not foreclosure. He didn't finish, but the implication hung in the air. She'd run the story, Margaret said. Front page, multiple parts, the kind of exposé that makes national news. Exactly, Thomas said. Public pressure forces legal action, makes it harder for the Thorns to use their influence to shut this down quietly. Over the next week, Maya's life transformed in ways she couldn't have imagined. She stayed with Margaret, sleeping in the guest room, eating regular meals, slowly learning what it felt like to have stability. Margaret enrolled her in the local elementary school, buying her new clothes and supplies. For the first time, Maya sat in a classroom with other children, though she felt years older than all of them. But her real education happened after school, when she'd return to Margaret's house and find Thomas Winters surrounded by documents, building the case. He'd explain legal concepts to her, treating her like an equal partner rather than a child. She learned about property law, statute of limitations, fiduciary duty. She learned how systems worked, how justice was supposed to function, and how often it didn't. 3 weeks after finding the cabin, Thomas called a meeting. Margaret, Maya, and 3 other attorneys gathered in the library conference room. We're ready, Thomas announced. Documentation verified, chain of custody established, preliminary filings prepared. I met with Amanda Chen yesterday, showed her everything related to her grandfather's case. She wept. And, Margaret prompted, and she's running the story. 5-part series starting this Sunday. The Thorn Conspiracy, how one family built an empire on stolen land. Full exposé, documents, photographs, interviews with descendants. She's even tracked down records of Eleanor Rose's disappearance, police reports that were never followed up, witnesses who saw her leaving her apartment looking terrified. Maya's heart raced. Eleanor, will people know what she did? Thomas smiled. She's going to be the hero of this story, Maya. The woman who risked everything to preserve the truth. Amanda's writing it that way. When do we file suit? One of the other attorneys asked. Monday morning, Thomas said, right after the first article runs. We're naming Samuel Thorn, his son Richard, Thorn Development Corporation, and the county for failing to investigate the original complaints. We're seeking property restitution for all 43 families. The Thorns will go nuclear, another attorney warned. Let them, Thomas said grimly. Let them show the world exactly who they are. That Sunday, Maya woke before dawn. She couldn't sleep, knowing what was coming. Margaret found her in the kitchen, staring at the darkness outside. "Big day," Margaret said softly. Maya nodded. "Eleanor waited 40 years for this." "She did," Margaret agreed. "But she'd be proud of you. You finished what she couldn't." They drove to the library early, where Thomas was already waiting with fresh copies of the Blue Hollow Gazette. The headline sprawled across the front page in bold letters: "Decades of Deception, the Thornland Fraud Exposed." Below it, a photograph of Eleanor Rose, young and determined, staring directly at the camera, and beside her photo one of Maya, taken by Amanda Chen during their interview, standing in front of the cabin that had held the truth all these years. Thomas read aloud, "8-year-old Maya discovers evidence that could topple a dynasty. In a forgotten cabin deep in the woods, one child's desperate search for shelter uncovered 40 years of buried crimes." The article detailed everything: the fraudulent foreclosures, the forged documents, Samuel Thorne's systematic theft. It told Eleanor's story with the respect she deserved, painting her as a hero who'd paid the ultimate price for trying to do what was right. And it introduced the 43 families who'd lost everything, giving them names and faces and dignity. By noon, the story had gone viral. National news outlets picked it up. Social media exploded with outrage. People who'd never heard of Blue Hollow were suddenly demanding justice for families they'd never met. Thomas's phone rang constantly, attorneys from across the country volunteering to help. Descendants of the stolen families calling with tears and gratitude. Reporters requesting interviews. And at Thorne Estate, according to sources Thomas had cultivated, panic had set in. Samuel Thorne, 89 and frail, was reportedly apoplectic. His son Richard had hired a team of crisis management specialists and the most expensive defense attorneys money could buy. But the evidence was public now. The truth was out, and no amount of money could bury it again. Monday morning, Thomas Winters walked into the county courthouse with a stack of legal filings 3 inches thick. Behind him walked 12 other attorneys, all pro bono, all committed. And beside Thomas, holding his hand because he'd asked her to be there, walked Maya. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But Maya kept her eyes forward, thinking of Eleanor Rose, thinking of Thomas Chen and the Rodriguez family and all the others whose names filled those filing cabinets. Thinking about how sometimes justice took 40 years, but it came anyway if someone was brave enough to dig. The courthouse steps felt like a stage, and Maya had never wanted to be on one. Cameras clicked like a swarm of mechanical insects, and reporters pressed forward, microphones extended like weapons. Thomas kept a protective hand on her shoulder as they climbed, his presence solid and reassuring. "Mr. Winters, what do you say to claims this is a politically motivated attack?" someone shouted. "Is it true the evidence was found by a child?" another called out. "Will Samuel Thorne face criminal charges?" Thomas stopped at the top of the steps and turned to face the crowd. The other attorneys formed a protective semicircle around Maya. "We're here today to file suit on behalf of 43 families whose land was stolen through systematic fraud between 1968 and 1976. The evidence is irrefutable. Eleanor Rose documented everything before her disappearance, and that documentation has been preserved. Justice delayed is not justice denied. These families deserve restitution." "What about the girl?" a reporter pressed. "How did an 8-year-old find evidence that's been hidden for 4 decades? Thomas looked down at Maya. She nodded slightly, giving permission. Maya found Eleanor Rose's cabin while seeking shelter from a storm. She discovered the bunker Eleanor had built, read her journals, and understood the significance of what she'd found. Then she did what Eleanor couldn't. She found people who would listen. She finished what Eleanor started. "Can we talk to her?" multiple voices asked at once. "No," Thomas said firmly. "Maya is a minor who's been through trauma. She's not a spectacle. She's a child who deserves privacy and protection. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have filings to submit." They entered the courthouse, the heavy doors cutting off the noise. Inside, the marble floors echoed with their footsteps. Court clerks and county employees stopped to stare as they passed, whispers following like a wake. At the clerk's office, Thomas presented the stack of documents. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, took them with shaking hands. "Is it true?" she whispered. "Everything in the papers? About Thorne?" "Every word," Thomas said. She looked at Maya, then back at Thomas. "My grandmother lost her house in 73. She never understood why, died thinking it was her fault." Her voice cracked. "Her name was Patricia Morrison." Maya's breath caught. "Morrison, she's in the files. Her foreclosure was faked. The payment records prove she never missed a payment." The clerk's eyes filled with tears. She stamped the documents with more force than necessary. "Good," she said. "I hope you destroy them." News of the filing spread through the courthouse like wildfire. By the time they left through a side entrance, avoiding the media circus out front, Maya could feel the shift. People were paying attention. People cared. That afternoon, back at Margaret's house, they watched the news coverage. Every channel led with the story. Legal experts debated the case's merits. Historians discussed land fraud in post-war America, and descendants of the 43 families began coming forward, some crying, some angry, all grateful that someone finally believed them. Amanda Chen's follow-up article ran the next day, this time focusing on Eleanor Rose's disappearance. She dug through police records, tracked down Eleanor's former co-workers, and interviewed people who remembered seeing suspicious activity around Eleanor's apartment in April of 1976. One witness, now in her 70s, remembered seeing two men in suits entering Eleanor's building the night before she vanished. "I thought they were cops," the woman said, "but cops don't usually drive cars that expensive." The article raised questions the authorities could no longer ignore. The state attorney general announced a formal investigation into Eleanor's disappearance. Cold case detectives reopened her file, and forensic teams were dispatched to search areas that had never been properly examined. But the Thorne family wasn't going quietly. 3 days after the initial filing, their response came. Not in court, but in the form of a counter-offensive that stunned everyone. Richard Thorne held a press conference at Thorne Estate, his father Samuel seated beside him in a wheelchair, looking frail but defiant. "These allegations are baseless," Richard declared, his voice smooth and practiced. "My father built his company through hard work and legitimate business practices. The documents being circulated are either fabricated or taken out of context. Eleanor Rose was a troubled woman who made serious accusations she couldn't substantiate, which is why no charges were ever filed." He continued, "As for the child being used as the face of this witch hunt, it's exploitation pure and simple. A vulnerable young girl has been manipulated by activists with a political agenda. We will not only defend ourselves vigorously in court, we'll be filing countersuits for defamation and demanding a full investigation into how a minor came to be involved in such a scheme." Maya watched from Margaret's couch, her stomach twisting. "They're calling me a liar." "They're desperate," Thomas said, standing by the window with his arms crossed. "That press conference was a mistake. They just made themselves look defensive." "But what if people believe them?" Maya asked quietly. Margaret sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "People who matter won't. The evidence speaks for itself." Thomas's phone rang. He answered, listened for a moment, and his expression shifted. "When?" he asked sharply. "How many?" He hung up and turned to them. 7 more families just came forward, not descendants. People who were children when their parents lost property to Thorne. They're in their 50s and 60s now, and they want to testify. Over the next week, the case exploded. What had started as 43 documented families grew to 62 as more people found courage to come forward. Each had a story. Each had pain that had never healed, and each wanted justice. Thomas and his team worked around the clock, verifying claims, gathering documentation, building a case that became more damning with each edition. Maya spent her days at school trying to be normal, but normal felt impossible. Kids stared at her in the hallways. Teachers looked at her with mixture of awe and concern. During recess, a girl named Sophie approached her. "Is it true you found buried treasure?" Sophie asked. "Not treasure," Maya said. "Evidence." "Of what?" Maya thought about how to explain something so complex to a 9-year-old. A man stole things from a lot of families a long time ago. A woman tried to stop him but couldn't, so she hid proof of what he did. And I found it. Sophie considered this. Like a superhero? More like a detective, Maya said. That's even cooler, Sophie decided. And just like that, Maya had her first real friend. But not everyone was supportive. One afternoon, Maya returned to Margaret's house to find graffiti sprayed across the garage door. "Liar," in angry red letters. Margaret stood in the driveway, hands on her hips, furious. "The police are coming," she said. "This is harassment." "It's just paint," Maya said quietly. "It's intimidation," Margaret corrected, "and it's unacceptable." The police came, took photos, filed a report. But everyone knew who was behind it, even if they couldn't prove it. The Thorne family had allies, people whose livelihoods depended on staying in their good graces, and some of those people were willing to cross lines. Thomas hired private security to watch Margaret's house, a quiet man named David who parked across the street every night. His presence should have made Maya feel safer, but instead, it made everything feel more real, more dangerous. 2 weeks after filing, Thomas received a call that changed everything. "They want to settle," he said, walking into Margaret's living room where the team had gathered. "The Thornes are offering a settlement." "How much?" one of the attorneys asked. $20 million, divided among all claimants, in exchange for dropping the suit and signing NDAs. Silence filled the room. 20 million was significant, life-changing for the families involved. But it also meant the truth would be buried again, sealed under non-disclosure agreements and legal protections. "What do the families want?" Margaret asked. "They're divided," Thomas admitted. "Some need the money desperately, others want their day in court, and," he looked at Maya, "some want to know what happened to Eleanor Rose. The settlement doesn't address that. It sweeps her disappearance under the rug." Maya stood up, her small frame suddenly feeling stronger than it had any right to. "Eleanor didn't hide the truth just so it could be bought again. She died protecting it. We can't let them pay it off." "Maya," Thomas said gently, "I understand your feelings, but this decision belongs to the families. They're the victims. They get to decide what justice looks like for them." "Then we need to tell them what justice could look like," Maya said. "We need to show them we can win." Thomas studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled. "You know what? You're right. We're not settling. We're going to trial." The decision rippled through the legal community like a shockwave. Attorneys on both sides prepared for what was being called the trial of the decade. Discovery began, with Thomas's team demanding decades of Thorne development records. The Thornes fought every request, but judges, increasingly influenced by public opinion, ruled against them more often than not. And then came the breakthrough. Among the thousands of documents produced during discovery, investigators found something Eleanor hadn't been able to access. Internal Thorne development memos from 1975 and 1976. Discussions about the Rose problem and strategies for containment. One memo, dated April 16, 1976, just 2 days before Eleanor's last journal entry, read, "Legal secretary has become untenable risk. Recommend immediate action. HK has been consulted and is standing by." The initials HK belonged to Harold Kincaid, a private investigator who'd worked for Thorne Development until his death in 2003. Amanda Chen tracked down Kincaid's daughter, now 52, who reluctantly admitted her father had done difficult jobs for wealthy clients. When pressed about Eleanor Rose, she broke down. "Dad came home different after that spring," she said. "Stopped sleeping, started drinking. He'd never been like that before. A few years before he died, he told me he'd done things he couldn't take back, things that haunted him. He never said specifics, but I knew. I always knew." The revelation hit the news like a bomb. The Thorne family wasn't just guilty of fraud. They were potentially implicated in Eleanor's disappearance, possibly her death. The state attorney general announced Eleanor Rose's case was now being treated as a homicide investigation. Forensic teams began searching properties owned by Thorne Development in '76, looking for remains. Samuel Thorne, 90 years old now and visibly declining, was questioned by investigators. He claimed to remember nothing, his lawyers citing age-related cognitive decline. But Richard Thorne was subpoenaed, his carefully constructed image crumbling under the weight of evidence suggesting his father had ordered or authorized actions that led to Eleanor's disappearance. Through it all, Maya went to school, did her homework, and tried to process what she'd set in motion. Some nights, she'd wake up trembling, wondering if she'd made the right choice. Other nights, she'd dream of Eleanor, standing in that cabin, smiling with relief that someone had finally heard her. Margaret became the steady presence Maya had been missing since her mother vanished. They established routines, breakfast together, homework at the kitchen table, evening walks through Margaret's neighborhood. Margaret never pushed, never demanded explanations for Maya's nightmares or sudden silences. She was just there, constant and kind. And slowly, Maya began to heal. Not completely. The wound of her mother's abandonment still ached, but the sharp edge of it dulled. She started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a life beyond survival. 1 month before the trial was set to begin, Maya received news that knocked the air from her lungs. A woman matching her mother's description had been found in a rehabilitation center 3 states away. She'd checked herself in 6 weeks ago, finally ready to fight the addiction that had consumed her life. She'd been asking about her daughter. Margaret drove Maya to meet her, Thomas coming along for support. The rehab facility was clean and bright, full of people working to rebuild lives they'd destroyed. And in a small visiting room, Maya saw her mother for the first time in 2 months. Mama looked different, thinner, older, exhausted, but her eyes were clear in a way Maya hadn't seen in years. "Baby," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Maya stood frozen, emotions warring inside her. Anger, relief, love, betrayal. "You left me," she said, her voice small. "I know," her mother sobbed. "I was sick, baby, so sick, and I thought you'd be better off without me dragging you down. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. I'm getting help now. Real help. And when I'm better, when I'm strong enough, I want—" She couldn't finish. "I want to be your mum again, if you'll let me." Maya looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. Then she looked back at her mother. The woman who'd given her life, who'd fought to protect her even when she was falling apart, who'd made the impossible choice to leave rather than let Maya watch her destroy herself. "Okay," Maya whispered, "but you have to promise, really promise." "I promise," her mother said. "On everything I am, I promise." They couldn't fix everything in one visit. Trust didn't rebuild that quickly, but it was a start. As they drove back to Blue Hollow, Maya felt something shift inside her. The fear that she'd be alone forever loosened its grip. She had Margaret now. She had Thomas. She had Sophie at school. And maybe, eventually, she'd have her mother back too. The trial began on a cold Monday in November. The courthouse was packed, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. News cameras lined the streets, and at the plaintiff's table sat Thomas Winters, his team of attorneys, and 3 representatives from the families seeking justice. Maya wasn't required to testify, being a minor, but she sat in the gallery every day, watching as the case unfolded, watching as Thomas systematically dismantled the Thorne family's defenses, watching as descendants of stolen families took the stand and shared their pain, and watching as Richard Thorne, polished and professional, slowly came apart under the weight of evidence he couldn't deny. The trial would last months. The outcome wasn't certain, but as Maya sat in that courtroom, surrounded by people fighting for truth, she understood something profound. Eleanor Rose hadn't died for nothing. The 43 families hadn't suffered in vain, and Maya, an 8-year-old girl who'd been seeking shelter from a storm, had found something more important than safety. She'd found purpose. The trial stretched across 3 months, each day revealing new layers of deception that had poisoned Blue Hollow for generations. Maya attended whenever school allowed, sitting in the gallery between Margaret and whoever from Thomas's team could spare time from preparation. She watched lawyers argue, witnesses testify, and truth slowly emerge from decades of buried lies. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Thomas called forensic document analysts who testified that signatures on dozens of foreclosure notices were forged. Handwriting experts showed how Samuel Thorne's signature appeared on bills of sale for properties supposedly purchased from the county, properties that had been fraudulently seized from their rightful owners. Real estate experts testified about property values, demonstrating that land acquired for thousands was worth millions by the time Thorne Development sold or developed it. But the most powerful testimony came from the families themselves. Thomas Chen's granddaughter, Amanda, the journalist who'd broken the story, took the stand and shared her grandfather's letters. She read Thomas Chen's words aloud in a courtroom packed with people, her voice breaking as she described how losing the farm had destroyed her great-grandfather, how the shame and confusion had fractured their family for generations. "My grandfather died believing he'd failed," Amanda said, tears streaming down her face. "He thought he'd lost our family's legacy through his own incompetence. But it wasn't his fault. It was theft. And for 40 years, no one would listen when we said something was wrong." An elderly man named Marcus Rodriguez testified about watching his father's spirit break after losing the farm that had been in their family since 1897. "Papa stopped talking," he said, his voice raw with old pain. "Just sat in a chair staring out the window at land he couldn't see anymore, land someone had stolen with papers he couldn't read because his English wasn't good enough. He died 6 months later. Doctor said heart attack. But I knew better. His heart broke first, then it stopped." One by one, families shared their stories. The Morrison family, the Williams family, the Delgado family. 43 families became 43 testimonies of loss, shame, and intergenerational trauma caused by systematic theft disguised as legal foreclosure. The defense tried to argue statute of limitations, claiming too much time had passed for legal action. But Thomas countered with precedent after precedent, cases where fraud extended the limitations period indefinitely. "Fraud concealed is fraud unpunished," he argued. The Thorne family actively hid their crimes, which tolls the statute. Justice delayed doesn't mean justice denied, not when the delay was caused by the defendant's own criminal acts. Richard Thorne took the stand in his own defense, polished and composed, his expensive suit and careful grooming a stark contrast to the working-class families he'd helped destroy. "My father built a legitimate business," he testified smoothly. "He purchased properties through legal channels. If there were irregularities in foreclosure proceedings, that's a matter for the county, not Thorne Development. We were simply buyers operating in good faith." But Thomas dismantled him piece by piece during cross-examination. He presented the internal memos discussing the Rose problem, forcing Richard to explain what they meant. He showed emails from Richard himself, dated as recently as 2018, referencing properties acquired in the 70s and acknowledging they'd come through complicated circumstances that are best left unexamined. "Best left unexamined," Thomas repeated, his voice sharp. "Why would legitimate property acquisitions be best left unexamined, Mr. Thorne?" Richard fumbled, his composure cracking. "That's not what I meant. It's simply that after so many years, the details become unclear." "Or perhaps," Thomas suggested, "you knew exactly how your father acquired those properties, and you've spent your entire career profiting from theft while working to ensure no one looked too closely." The defense objected. The judge sustained. But the point had landed. Then came the revelation that changed everything. On the 67th day of trial, investigators searching a property Thorne Development had owned in 1976 but sold in 1982 made a discovery. In a remote section of the property, now part of a state park, cadaver dogs alerted to an area near an old foundation. Excavation revealed human remains. Female, approximately 30 years old at time of death, buried in a shallow grave with personal effects that included a bracelet engraved with the initials ER. The courtroom erupted when the news broke. Judge Patricia Morrison, the granddaughter of Patricia Morrison whose foreclosure had been part of the fraud, called for order, her gavel sounding like thunder. "We will have silence, or I will clear this courtroom." Eleanor Rose had been found. After 47 years, she could finally come home. The trial recessed for 2 weeks while authorities processed the scene and prepared forensic evidence. Medical examiners determined Eleanor had died from blunt force trauma to the head, murder, not accident, not suicide, murder, and she'd been buried on property owned by Thorn Development at the time of her disappearance. When the trial resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. This wasn't just about land fraud anymore. This was about a woman who'd been killed for trying to expose the truth. The State Attorney General filed criminal charges against Samuel Thorn for conspiracy to commit murder, though his declining health made prosecution uncertain. Richard Thorn was charged as an accessory after the fact, with evidence suggesting he'd known about Eleanor's death and had worked to keep the burial site concealed. Maya sat in the gallery the day the verdict was read, Margaret's hand gripping hers tightly. The jury had deliberated for 5 days. 5 days of waiting, of wondering, of hoping that Eleanor's sacrifice hadn't been for nothing. The jury foreman stood, a middle-aged black woman who'd been a teacher before retirement. Judge Morrison asked for the verdict. "On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant Thorn Development Corporation guilty. On the count of unjust enrichment, guilty. On 43 counts of property theft through fraudulent foreclosure, guilty." The courtroom exploded with sound, people crying, shouting, embracing. 43 guilty verdicts, 43 families vindicated. The judge's gavel sounded repeatedly, but even she was wiping tears from her eyes. When order finally restored, the foreman continued with the penalties. "We recommend full restitution to all affected families, including current property value calculations, compensation for decades of lost use and enjoyment, and punitive damages in the amount of $250 million. Richard Thorn's face went white. His attorneys immediately began preparing appeals, but Thomas stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we'd also like to move for the criminal prosecution of Richard Thorn to proceed on the murder charges related to Eleanor Rose. The evidence is clear. His family's company owned the property where she was buried. His own memos reference the Rose problem and its resolution. He has profited for decades from crimes that included murder." Judge Morrison nodded. "The criminal case will proceed separately, but Mr. Thorn, I'm remanding you to custody pending trial. Bail is denied, given the severity of charges and your family's resources." Richard Thorn was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his expression stunned, as if he couldn't believe his carefully constructed world had finally collapsed. That evening, Blue Hollow celebrated in ways the town hadn't in decades. Families who'd testified gathered at the community center, tears and laughter mixing as they processed what had happened. After 47 years, they had justice. Not complete, not perfect, but real. Maya stood quietly in the corner, watching the celebration, feeling separate from it. She'd helped start this, but these weren't her families, her losses. She was just the girl who'd found the cabin. Margaret found her there, wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You should be proud," Margaret said softly. "I just found it," Maya said. "Eleanor did the real work." "Eleanor documented it," Margaret corrected. "But you finished it. You trusted the right people. You didn't give up when things got scary. You gave these families their dignity back." She paused. "Eleanor would be proud of you." Thomas approached, exhausted but triumphant. "There's someone who wants to meet you," he said. He led Maya through the crowd to a woman in her 50s with grey-streaked hair and Eleanor's eyes. "Maya, this is Helen Rose Blackwood, Eleanor's niece." Helen knelt down to Maya's level, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "My aunt disappeared when I was 7. My whole childhood, I wondered what happened to her, if she'd run away, if we'd done something wrong. And now I know. She didn't abandon us. She died trying to do the right thing. And you made sure her death meant something." Maya didn't know what to say. so she just hugged Helen, and they cried together for an aunt and a stranger who were the same brave woman. The weeks following the verdict were a whirlwind. The Thorne family's assets were frozen pending restitution payments. Properties were assessed, values calculated, complicated legal formulas determining how to fairly compensate families for decades of loss. Some families chose to reclaim their original land if it was still vacant. Others took monetary settlements. All of them got acknowledgement that what happened to them wasn't their fault. Samuel Thorne died 3 weeks after the verdict, 90 years old and ruined. The obituaries were brutal, detailing not his business success but his criminal enterprise. The mansion on the hill, Thorne Estate, was seized as part of restitution and converted into a community centre serving low-income families. Poetic justice, people called it. Richard Thorne's criminal trial began in the spring. Unlike the civil case, this one was quick. The evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted of accessory to murder after the fact and conspiracy to conceal a homicide, sentenced to 20 years, though his attorneys promised appeals that would take years to exhaust. But for Maya, life began settling into something resembling normal. The media attention faded. The reporters stopped camping outside Margaret's house, and slowly she became just a kid again, or as close to just a kid as she could be after everything she'd experienced. Her mother completed rehab and moved to Blue Hollow, finding work at the library Margaret had called in a favor and renting a small apartment near Margaret's house. Their relationship rebuilt slowly, tentatively. Weekly dinners at first, then twice a week, then regular overnight stays. Trust grew in small increments, earned through consistency and kept promises. Maya spent the summer between 3rd and 4th grade helping coordinate what Eleanor's legacy would become. Helen Rose Blackwood donated funds to restore the cabin, transforming it into the Eleanor Rose Justice Center, a museum and educational space dedicated to Eleanor's memory and the families she'd tried to protect. The bunker beneath remained intact, preserved exactly as Eleanor had left it. Visitors could descend those stone stairs and see the filing cabinets, read the documents, understand the scope of what one woman had documented in her fight against corruption. Maya helped design the exhibits, insisting certain things be included. Thomas Chen's letter, the photographs of families standing in front of homes they'd lost. Eleanor's journal, displayed under glass with her final entry visible. If you're reading this, then I didn't make it. But you did. You found the cabin. You found the key. You found the truth. The center opened in September with families from all 43 cases attending. Helen Rose Blackwood gave a speech honoring her aunt's courage. Thomas Winters spoke about how justice, even delayed, matters. Amanda Chen discussed the role of journalism in exposing corruption, and Maya, now 9 years old, stood at the podium looking out at hundreds of faces and shared what she'd learned. "I was 8 when I found the cabin," she began, her voice small but steady. "I was cold and hungry and alone, and I just wanted somewhere safe to sleep. I didn't know I was going to find something important. But Eleanor, she knew. She knew someone would come eventually. Someone who needed shelter, or who was lost, or who was looking for something. And she prepared for that moment." Maya paused, gathering courage. Eleanor couldn't finish her fight. The people she tried to stop were too powerful, and they hurt her for trying. But she didn't let that make her quit. She just changed how she fought. She preserved the truth and trusted that someday someone would find it and have the courage to use it. She trusted the future even when the present was scary. "And that's," Maya's voice cracked, "that's the bravest thing I've ever heard of." The audience stood, applause washing over her like a wave. But Maya wasn't thinking about them. She was thinking about Eleanor, hoping somehow she knew that her faith hadn't been misplaced, that the truth she died protecting had finally come to light. That fall, Maya started 4th grade. She'd been at Blue Hollow Elementary for a full year now, no longer the new kid or the famous kid who'd exposed the Thorne conspiracy. Just Maya, who was good at math and terrible at spelling and whose best friend Sophie made her laugh until her stomach hurt. She lived with Margaret officially now, the adoption finalized in August after months of home studies and legal proceedings. Her mother attended the hearing, supporting the decision even though it hurt. "You deserve stability," she'd told Maya. "Margaret can give you that in ways I can't, not yet, but I'm still your mum, always." "I know, Mama," Maya had said. And she did know. Love didn't have to be either or. She could love Margaret for the safety and structure she provided while still loving her mother for trying, for fighting her demons, for choosing recovery even when it meant letting Maya go. The Eleanor Rose Justice Center became a destination. School groups visited to learn about property rights and the importance of documentation. Law students studied the case as an example of how systematic fraud could hide in plain sight for decades. Families dealing with similar injustices reached out, seeking advice and inspiration. And Maya became something she never expected, a symbol. Not of childhood innocence, which she'd lost long before finding the cabin, but of ordinary courage. The kind that shows up when you're scared and keeps going anyway. The kind that trusts there are good people in the world even when the bad ones seem to win. The kind that believes truth matters even when lies are easier. 1 year after finding the cabin, Maya returned to it alone. Well, not entirely alone. Margaret waited in the car, giving her space but staying close. Maya walked through the forest she'd stumbled through in the rain, but this time the path was clear. The cabin had been restored, its stone walls repointed, roof repaired, windows replaced, but it still felt like Eleanor's place, like the sanctuary it had been designed to be. She unlocked the door with the key Helen had given her, a replica of the original brass key that now sat in a display case at the Justice Center. Inside, everything was preserved but improved. The reading chair where she'd slept that first night now sat in a roped-off section with a placard explaining its significance. The trunk in the corner was open, displaying the blankets that had kept her warm, and the hatch in the floor remained, though now it had a proper cover and lighting for the stairs. Maya descended into the bunker one more time. The filing cabinets were still here, though their contents had been digitized and stored in multiple locations to ensure they could never be lost again. The desk where Eleanor had worked still held her typewriter, the keys worn smooth from use. On the wall, someone had hung a photograph of Eleanor, young and determined, standing in front of the county attorney's office where she'd worked. Maya stood before it, studying the face of the woman who'd changed her life without ever meeting her. "Thank you," Maya whispered, "for being brave enough to try, for caring about people you didn't know, for trusting that someone would find what you left behind." She touched her fingers to the photograph gently. "I found it, and I promise I'm going to keep trying to be the kind of person you thought would come. The kind who doesn't look away when things are hard. The kind who finishes what needs finishing." The photograph didn't answer. But somehow, standing in that underground room that had held secrets for so long, Maya felt something like peace. Like Eleanor's spirit, wherever it was, could finally rest. That evening, back at Margaret's house, Maya sat at the kitchen table doing homework while Margaret prepared dinner. It was ordinary, mundane, the kind of evening she'd once dreamed about when every night was a fight for survival. Her mother was coming for dinner, bringing dessert she'd made herself. Sophie was sleeping over afterward, and they planned to build a blanket fort and watch movies until they fell asleep. Normal. Safe. Home. Maya looked up from her math worksheet to find Margaret watching her with soft eyes. "What?" Maya asked. "Nothing," Margaret said. "Just thinking about how far you've come, about how proud I am of who you are." Maya's throat tightened. "I didn't do anything that special. I just found something." Margaret shook her head. "You found something, yes, but then you did something with it. That's what made the difference. Lots of people find injustice. Most look away. You didn't." "Eleanor didn't look away first," Maya pointed out. "No," Margaret agreed. "She didn't. But you finished what she started. You were the answer to her hope. That's not nothing, Maya. That's everything." Later, after dinner and dessert and laughter around the table. After Sophie arrived and they built their fort, and Margaret kissed them both good night, Maya lay in the darkness thinking. Thinking about storms and cabins and secrets buried beneath floorboards. Thinking about a woman who'd died 47 years ago but whose courage still echoed forward in time. Thinking about 43 families who'd lost everything and now had acknowledgement, if not full restoration. Thinking about how one person's decision to document truth could change the trajectory of justice decades later. And thinking about herself, the homeless little girl who'd been looking for shelter and found purpose instead. Who'd been alone and scared and had somehow become someone people looked to as an example of strength. She didn't feel strong most days. She still had nightmares, still flinched at loud noises, still worried her mother might disappear again, still felt the weight of everything she'd seen and lost. But she also felt hope. Real hope, not the desperate kind she'd clung to when she had nothing else, but the kind built on evidence. Evidence that people could be good, that justice could win, that truth mattered, that finishing what others started was possible, that even the smallest person could make the biggest difference if they refused to look away. Beside her in the fort, Sophie breathed softly in sleep. Downstairs, Margaret moved quietly through the house, checking locks and turning off lights. Next door, her mother was probably just getting home from her evening shift, tired but sober, keeping the promises she'd made. And somewhere in the darkness, the Eleanor Rose Justice Center stood as a monument to courage, to a woman who'd died fighting and a child who'd finished her fight. Maya closed her eyes and let sleep come, knowing that tomorrow she'd wake up in a real bed, in a real home, with real people who cared about her. Knowing that Eleanor's story, and her own, would keep inspiring others to be brave when being brave felt impossible. Knowing that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight takes decades and the victory comes long after the warrior has fallen. Because in the end, justice doesn't belong to those who seize it first or protect it hardest. It belongs to those who believe in it enough to keep it alive, to preserve it through storms and silence, to trust that someday someone will find it and know exactly what to do. Eleanor Rose had been that someone for 43 families. Maya had been that someone for Eleanor. And now the story would ripple forward, teaching others that courage comes in all sizes, that truth outlasts lies, and that the bravest thing you can do is trust that your actions, no matter how small they seem, might be exactly what changes everything. Years would pass. Maya would grow up, graduate high school, attend college on a scholarship established in Eleanor's name. She'd study law, inspired by Thomas Winters, determined to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She'd return to Blue Hollow and work at the Justice Center, helping families navigate property disputes and historical injustices. She'd become the kind of person Eleanor had hoped would find her cabin, the kind who finished things. But that was all still ahead. Tonight, she was just a 9-year-old girl sleeping in a blanket fort with her best friend, safe in a home where she was loved, at peace in a town that had finally acknowledged its darkest chapter and chosen to do better. The cabin in the woods stood empty now, but it was no longer forgotten. Eleanor Rose's name was no longer buried under silence, and the little homeless girl who'd found shelter from a storm had become the keeper of a legacy that proved sometimes the quietest voices carry the most powerful truths, if only someone is brave enough to listen. Anyone can change the world if they're willing to trust that truth matters more than comfort, that justice delayed isn't justice denied, and that the smallest act of courage can echo across decades. Maya proved it. Eleanor Rose proved it. And now their story proves it for everyone who needs to remember that being brave doesn't mean being big, strong, or powerful. It just means refusing to look away, even when looking away would be easier, especially then. As the years rolled forward and Blue Hollow transformed from a town haunted by buried secrets into a community defined by acknowledged truth and genuine reconciliation, the Eleanor Rose Justice Center stood as proof that one person's courage combined with another person's determination could indeed move mountains, or at least move the hearts of those who'd forgotten that mountains could be moved at all. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering truth with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that courage can come from the most unexpected places and that justice, no matter how delayed, is always worth fighting for.